Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero. Our guest today is Dr. David Priess. He was an intelligence officer in the CIA and a daily intelligence briefer for guys like then FBI Director Robert Mueller and Attorney General John Ashcroft. He would present to them the highlights of the PDB, that's the President's Daily Brief, and other relevant intelligence materials, but the PDB was the subject of Dr. Priess's 2016 book titled The President's Book of Secrets, The Untold Story of Intelligence Briefings to America's Presidents. It was a great excuse for him to become the first author to interview every living former president, vice president, and the CIA directors from those past administrations. What an outstanding brain trust to call upon, and you can bet it was no easy feat to get clearance to write on the subject. His latest book is called, get this, How to Get Rid of a President, History's Guide to Removing Unpopular, Unable, or Unfit Chief Executives, and it comes out next month. He's been working on it since long before the House impeachment inquiry began, so it's quite a timely coincidence that it's coming out now. His analysis and commentary has appeared in outlets to include The Washington Post, Politico, The Cipher Brief, and The Houston Chronicle, and he's appeared on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, NPR, and the BBC, among many other networks. Today, David joins us to talk about the new book, the previous book, and how it's all shaking out for him now that he's got the world by the tail more than ever. Now, a brief sideline, because not everyone has the world by the tail all the time, and sometimes even those who do don't seem to see it that way. Over the weekend, the BHS class of 87, that's Pete's class and my wife Christy's class too, lost a solid guy who took his own life. Terry Martin Marcacci was there for all the highlights and was at the center of many of them. He leaves behind a lovely daughter and tons of friends who will miss him on the softball and baseball fields and all over town. And those of us who knew him all seem to be saying the same thing to each other in his passing. And I'll say it to all of you. If you feel like you've got nothing left, please reach out. Talk to a friend. Don't think you have a friend? I'm your friend. Pete is your friend. You don't believe me? Try it. Reach out to either of us. Reach out to someone you care about. And please let them care about you. We all couldn't believe Terry didn't know how much we all cared about him. He was loved by a lot of people. And I bet so are you. So if you're feeling like it's pretty dark, please let someone you love you. And if you don't want to call me or Pete or someone else you know, call 800-273-8255. That's the National Suicide Prevention Line. And again, it's 800-273-8255. But back to today's guest. He's a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute of George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, where he's taught political science, as well as at George Washington University and at Duke. And his insight is a hot commodity right now, even more than usual. Here's our special guest today, Dr. David Priess.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is David Priess, the author of The President's Book of Secrets and How to Get Rid of a President. And you're listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, we have David Priess on, and I'm actually looking at, for a change, John Leon Guerrero sitting on my couch next to my dog. And so I'm going to say these couple of words, and I'm going to get out of the way because I know John's got an intro that's going to be awesome. This is going to be also a hashtag Spy versus Spy episode because we're going to talk about some espionage stuff. And I'm super excited to have David on, and I want to give a shout out to Dan Gabriel, whose movie Mosul is fantastic. I think it's going to be, well, I know it's Oscar grade. Hopefully in about 6 months, we'll find out that he actually wins the Oscar. But in the meantime, John, welcome.
Yeah, well, it's great to be right in front of you, and it's great to talk to you. Dr. David Priess has written 2 books, The President's Book of Secrets, the subtitle of which is The Untold Story of Intelligence Briefings to America's Presidents. And the other book is How to Get Rid of a President, History's Guide to Removing Unpopular, Unable, and Unfit Chief Executives. Great titles, both of them. For everybody, you can get David on Twitter at David Priess, and you should buy the books on Amazon, where you can get the book in book form, you can get the audio book, and you can get the Kindle versions as well. It's great to talk with you. Your ability to name a book is terrific. Let me start there.
Well, thanks. It's great to talk to you guys too. And honestly, it's hard to come up with a book title because you do years of research and you interview people and you dig into the archives and you try to tell stories that are both interesting and important. And then the publisher says, okay, we need about 5 or 6 words. And you say, really? Because there's a whole lot more that's going on in this than just a catchphrase or a soundbite. But I realized with the first one, it's the story of the president's daily brief, this top secret intelligence document. And it really is the president's book of secrets. And that captures a whole lot because it mentions the president, it mentions that it is a physical book, and it mentions that it carries forward secrets. So that one wasn't that hard. The new one was a lot harder because we wanted to convey, the book is about all the ways presidents have left office from the beginning until now. And in these times, anything you write is seen as political, even when it's not.
Hey, this is Pete. Real quick, I just want to let you guys know we are proud to announce our official support of Save the Brave, a certified nonprofit 501c3 with a charter of helping veterans with post-traumatic stress. Here's how you can help. Go to savethebrave.com, click on the link on the website, and my recommendation is this. Subscribe. Give them $20 a month. You've got subscriptions that you can turn off right now that you're not using that are $20 a month. Swap that out. Get involved. Let's help these folks out.
In these times, anything you write is seen as political, even when it's not. So I tried to keep it narrow, saying this is how Americans get rid of presidents, but they wanted it to be just a little more direct and short. So it shortened to how to get rid of a president, which some people think sounds like it's saying how to get rid of this president or how to take out like a president violently. Yeah.
For this one.
It's definitely got that. If you're a fan of this president, it talks about all the ways that people have tried to remove presidents and failed. So it's a how-to guide to help prevent it from happening. But if you think this president is not fit for office, it talks about all the ways that our system has to help undermine and remove a president. So I guess it's a little something for everyone.
A little something for everyone. So one of the things I want to point people towards, if you guys go towards the internet, you can find David Priess talking a lot about this. There's a lot you've talked about already on this book, but let's dive in a little bit. 4 presidents have died in the office of natural-ish causes. 4 have been assassinated. So you definitely can have them die to get out of office.
Sure.
Obviously, you can impeach. That's 3 of them have had some kind of impeachment end. What else is out there?
Well, you've got a whole bunch of ideas, and I interpret removing a president widely. That is, in some ways, you can remove a president by keeping him in office and just curtailing his powers. So I include a whole chapter on that, which is removal in place. You can also preemptively remove them. That is, and you can imagine, looking at an opposing candidate who is so well prepared for the job, has such a good resume, is such a skilled politician, that once he or she gets into office, it's going to be really hard to counter them and to ultimately get them out of the office. So a savvy political operator will say, well, let's keep them from getting into office in the first place. Let's preemptively remove them. And I have a whole chapter on cases where that's happened in history. Some would say the Russians helped do that in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. I don't address that case specifically. I look at some of the cases in history where there's somebody like Henry Clay, who's a man that all of us should know in American history, and yet I knew almost nothing about him simply because he ran for president time after time after time, and Andrew Jackson and his allies had him as their enemy number one and did everything fair or foul to keep him out of office.
Yeah, it was never quite his time. He had a lot of time, but he didn't have timing on his side. He was always... Yeah.
No, and that's part of the problem disaggregating this is, can you say that this person would have been president except for that? Well, at least in Clay's case, it's pretty easy to say he would have been. But in each case, it's hard to tell. But what I was trying to do is look at all of these different methods, up to and including ones we haven't used yet. We have not removed a president by impeachment going through its full cycle and having the Senate vote to kick the president out. I argue in the book that Nixon was removed by impeachment because he saw the writing on the wall. He knew he would be impeached by the House and removed by the Senate. So he just resigned first. But we also have a way of removing a president in the Constitution that's never been tried. And that is declaring the president disabled by Section 4 of the 25th Amendment. And that's a tough judgment to get to. But if the president is unable to do the job, clearly there needs to be somebody else in there. And we have a mechanism for doing that.
Was the 25th Amendment in place when Wilson was president?
No, but it should have been, because Woodrow Wilson, I think you're alluding to the fact he had a massive stroke and he was effectively incapacitated at least for months. Some would say until near the end of his term, for over a year. And his doctor and his wife were essentially running the country because the vice president didn't step in. There was no clear mechanism for him to do so. And everybody just had to trust the doctor and the wife when they came down from the residence with signed papers in a scribble that kind of looked like Woodrow Wilson's. And they said, yeah, this is what the president wants. This is what he's doing, but he needs to rest and recuperate. Well, for all everybody else knew, he was dead for a while. Nobody knew for sure. We sure could have used a mechanism to have the president step aside temporarily while he was disabled.
I really liked a lot of the, I don't want to call them trivia points, but the things like Henry Clay. I knew nothing about Henry Clay. And to find out that we meaning, of course, we weren't around, but our country elected Andrew Jackson because he was decisive, or maybe avoided electing Henry Clay because he was a compromiser.
Right.
And that was seen as being wishy-washy, maybe. And that,
I don't know how that plays out because we're relying on the histories that people wrote down from the time. We don't know what it was actually like, because Henry Clay was a pretty active guy too. I mean, he wasn't a guy who avoided confrontation. He was somebody who had a reputation for decades of staying up late, drinking, playing cards, kind of being the guy at the center of it all. But it wasn't his way or the highway, which was more Andrew Jackson's style. With Henry Clay, he helped put together two of the biggest compromises in American history that forestalled civil war. Now, you could say that maybe he shouldn't have done that. Maybe he should have stood up for what was right and said, if we're going to fight, we might as well do it now. But he was always looking for a way for what used to be called America First in a very different context, which was, first, we need to be unified as a country. We cannot allow anything to split us apart. And if I have to broker a compromise with people who politically I don't like in order to do what's best for the long-term interest of this country, damn it, I'm going to do it. And he did that over and over again and seemed respected for it at the time. But I do speculate that maybe that was the one thing that held him back. When there's a former general, a man of action, a man, like you said, who's a decisive guy politically and personally, sometimes Americans rally to that, even if they think it's not in their best interests. They like the guy who's out there just screaming at everybody else, telling them they're wrong.
Well, and if you want a character from all of the presidents that we've ever had, Andrew Jackson's one of them. He's got bullets in him from duels. He won the Battle of New Orleans, won that Battle of New Orleans against the best military in the world.
That's right. And did it unknowingly, did it after we'd already reached a truce to end the war, which didn't affect the war. But I tell you, Andrew Jackson shows up in another place in the research that's in this book and ended up in the book, because he was nearly our first assassinated president. We had a disgruntled guy who ran up to him on the Capitol steps one day. There was no Secret Service back then, no personal protection at all. And somebody just walks up to Jackson and point blank fires a pistol right at him. And everybody heard the gun go off, hit the ground. And then they looked at Jackson and he was fine because for some reason the gun fired, but the bullet didn't go. And everybody think, oh, what a relief. Well, then the assassin pulls out another pistol with the other hand and shoots at Jackson point blank. And sure enough, that one fires and the bullet doesn't come out. The police later looked at that and they analyzed the guns and they said it must have been the humidity and something it did to the gunpowder because it didn't actually fully ignite. more chance of 1 in 10,000 that both guns would not go off. But sure enough, Jackson, being the man of action, what does he do? Does he run? Does he cower? Does he hide? No, he was after the assassin with his cane, and people say he probably would have beaten him to death, except that people got to him before he could land any blows.
Yeah, it's funny when you contrast these things because Zach Taylor, he gets killed by cherries and cream.
Yeah. I mean, some presidents have died in ways that aren't really noble just by getting sick. Warren Harding died of just what appears to be a heart attack because he just really wasn't taking care of himself. Zachary Taylor, just unlucky by getting some infected or somehow contaminated food during a hot summer. These aren't what we would call noble deaths. Not that an assassination is necessarily noble, but we certainly talk a lot more about Lincoln and about Kennedy than we do about Zachary Taylor and Warren Harding.
But not about Garfield and McKinley as much. They don't get the love.
Yeah, they've gotten some attention. I think James Garfield in particular was one of those guys. He probably would have been a really good president if he had served a full term, maybe 2 terms. But instead, he was cut off very quickly in his term by an assassin. And then William McKinley, who did have a little more time in office and was getting very well regarded, he was killed. And what people forget about that one is McKinley was killed in essentially an anarchist plot. Now, the person who did it didn't appear in all investigations to be involved with international anarchism. He wasn't directed by a foreign power, but he was certainly influenced by all of the anarchist assassinations in Europe that had been going on in the previous decades. And he took it into his own hands to say that this man shouldn't be president. And I make clear in the book, we have constitutional methods and we have political methods for removing a president. Assassination is never the correct attitude because that means it's one person deciding that they, more than 300 million people in this country, have the right not only to decide who should be leading the country, but whether a man should live or die. And that's just wrong on all counts.
I'm going to throw in my lot about William McKinley because I like him. I'm from Guam. And I wouldn't be sitting in Pete's living room today if it weren't for William McKinley. But I agree with you in that we can't allow a single person to dictate the fate of who's our commander-in-chief. Mm-hmm. In a way, though, he probably speaks for at least a fraction of the country. And in that, he's expediting the impeachment process, wrong as it is.
You can see that in each of these assassinations, probably less so with Garfield. Garfield, it was somebody who clearly had mental illness. Mm-hmm. He's often described as a disgruntled office seeker. Charles Guiteau was his name, and he had been lobbying the new administration of James Garfield and his Secretary of State. He had been lobbying for jobs. He wanted to be posted to Paris as a diplomat. He wanted to get another job. And they just looked at him and said, no, I mean, you have no background. You have no credible reason to be this. But back in those days, you could walk into the White House or walk into the Secretary of State's office and just sit in the outer room and wait to be seen. And the Secretary of State remembered this guy after the assassination and said, oh, yeah, I know him. He's the guy who kept coming in and asking for a job. But it wasn't just that he was a disgruntled office seeker. He was clearly delusional. And he thought that Garfield owed him the election because he had something like written a pamphlet or tried to give one speech during the campaign on behalf of Garfield. So in that case, I don't think he represented a greater movement. Even people who were opposed to Garfield politically absolutely abhorred the assassination and thought it was wrong. To the extent that other assassinations, yes, other people didn't like some of Kennedy's policies, but none of them praised Lee Harvey Oswald for doing what he did. Similarly with Lincoln, there were a whole bunch of people in the Confederacy who had every reason to hate Abraham Lincoln, and yet they really were not making a hero out of John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators after that happened.
Well, on the topic of expediting impeachment, do you think that the impeachment process is so daunting that I don't necessarily want to use this current president as an example, but is it really something that creates constraint in the president, or is it something that the president and maybe this president has figured out that process is so darn long, I'm not going to worry about it?
Yeah, I looked at this 2 ways when I was researching the book. One is the history itself, is have we had attempts at impeachment and has it mattered at all for any individual presidents? And yeah, we've had two presidents who were impeached for bad behavior. One, Andrew Johnson in the 1860s, and then Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Both of them were impeached. That is, they were voted by the House of Representatives with a majority vote that they were accused of these crimes, things like abuse of power, things like that. Now, they were not convicted by the Senate, because in the Senate, there has to be a 2/3 vote, which is a pretty high bar. Even in Johnson's case, when the opposing political party had a 2/3 majority, they still didn't kick the president out. But what happened? After Andrew Johnson's case, he actually improved his behavior. Some of the things he'd been doing that were the most heinous actually improved because he knew that he had to make promises in order not to get kicked out. So in a sense, the impeachment process did work. It didn't remove the president, but it removed his worst traits. And then I also talked to constitutional scholars, people who have looked at this, who have analyzed this a lot longer than I have. And I asked them, and one of them told me something telling. He said, every president has been constrained by the possibility of impeachment. That is, knowing that there are some lines you probably can't cross keeps you from going up to or crossing that line. So it's not the same as being accused of impeachable acts and then being put on trial. But there may have been presidents, let's say Andrew Jackson. Maybe he wanted to just shoot Henry Clay in the street and say, I can shoot him and get away with it. But he knew he would be impeached. And so maybe that was a factor why he didn't do it.
What about someone like John Adams? He's so early in the whole thing, but he was also so, I guess you could kind of say he had a Trumpian ability to create contention around him without even trying.
You know, what's funny is when I looked back at the early days of America, which is an area I had not studied extensively, I'll be honest. I mean, I had focused on the modern presidency because of my focus on intelligence. We didn't have intelligence to speak of back then in America. But when I looked at the political history of early America, I could not believe how jarring it was, because I have this impression that here are these nice old gentlemen who are polite to each other, and they wear their fancy suits and they call each other honorific names, and then they get together and drink wine looking out over their farmyards. And that's what I thought, because everybody says today's political discourse is the most partisan and the most rough we've ever had. When I looked at what Jefferson and Adams were saying against each other and what their partisans were saying against each other, I mean, Jefferson's allies were saying that John Adams was going to become the king and take over the country and at best give it to Great Britain, but probably just rule it as a despot himself. Some of John Adams' partisans were saying that Thomas Jefferson was a Satanist who was sacrificing dogs on altars at his home in Virginia. I mean, that's some pretty harsh political rhetoric. So it certainly took the blinds off of my eyes in terms of thinking that we're at a lower place than we've ever been before in political rhetoric. For God's sakes, we had a civil war where we were literally killing each other. So in that sense, it gave me a real good sense of history that we've been through a lot as a country. We've been through some pretty dark times, and we've always emerged stronger eventually.
Yeah, it's too bad that people don't see those examples and don't understand that kind of rhetoric that went back and forth between, like you brought up, Jefferson and Adams, and that most people don't see that they reconciled at the end of their lives.
It took them a long time. They didn't talk for many years, but then at the end, they became what we would today probably think of pen pals, right?
Yeah.
If they had an internet, they would have been those people, you know, exchanging joke memes with each other over the internet every day, because they bonded in a sense. They were the last two of that real founding generation from the 1770s, and they got together. And there is a lesson there for us, John, because I think a lot of us forget the fact that, you know, we are in this together. It doesn't feel like it day to day because we're arguing over policy or we're arguing over other issues. But when it comes down to it, our policies do affect all of us, and we have to work on a lot of them together to make them work. So it's really been a theme throughout my writings and speaking is let's look at history to see what lessons we can learn, because if there were mistakes made in the past, let's not make the same mistakes. Let's make all new ones, but let's not repeat the ones that have already been made that we should know better. And let's see if there's some things that worked well in the past that we can actually do again so that it's not as painful when we climb out of one of these dark times.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the impeachment process, because it seems like if you're a popular president and your party carries the House and the Senate, which is what you would basically need, and then have it go bad to get someone out. Otherwise, there's just too much turnover in the legislature, it seems like to me, to reliably get somebody out. I mean, we have a president right now that people are desperate for him to be impeached, but it's just not going to happen because, the Congress is it's so hard. What are your thoughts?
Impeachment's a funny thing. On the one hand, it's written like it's a judicial proceeding. In the Constitution, it describes it as a court of impeachment with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presiding over it. So they use very legalistic language. But it's actually a political process because the founders quite consciously did not say all of these issues about whether a president is fit or not should be just taken to the regular courts. They didn't even put it in the Supreme Court. They put it in the people's house. The most closely elected representatives to the people is the House of Representatives every 2 years. And they wanted them to decide whether the president had committed an act that was worthy of removal from office and then recommend it to the Senate, which were indirectly elected back then, but still close to the people. They wanted it to be a political process. They wanted the people judging this to take into account not only what did the president do, but is it something that merits yanking him out of office against the will of the people some years before and putting in someone else? So to me, the fact that impeachment is hard is a good thing. It's supposed to be hard because we don't want it to be politically easy. That's why they put in the Constitution 3 reasons and only 3 reasons to impeach a president. One is bribery. They were concerned about a president, and they argued this in the Constitutional Convention. They were worried about a president using massive amounts of money to simply buy off electors. Okay, that's a big one. Another one was treason. And they defined treason in the Constitution. It's unlikely to be met now because it was written in the way they thought back then. It involved a time of war. It involved having witnesses to the treason. But then they offered a third, which was high crimes and misdemeanors. And if that phrase doesn't immediately conjure up something for you, you're not alone because nobody knows exactly what it means. It was written to kind of capture other major issues, whether in the criminal statutes or not, that would warrant the president's removal because he's unfit to hold the office. Well, in the past, presidents have been impeached for things like abuse of power, for things like perjury, for things like obstruction of justice. They haven't been removed yet, but that's the kind of thing that high crimes and misdemeanors means. They wanted it to be something that was major, not the president called me a bad name on TV, so we're going to impeach him. Believe it or not, that was very close to what they did with Andrew Johnson. One of the articles of impeachment against him was the president went on a speaking tour and said really nasty things about members of Congress, so he should be impeached. And that one did not pass. And instead, they stuck to the ones that were more serious.
Wow, it's funny. And then I also think about all of the near attempts that, like Andrew Jackson or Truman or any other guys that damn near, redo that circumstance and they're easily dead. It's crazy that we've only had as little turnover as we've had, but it's still well over 10% that presidents don't.
It's funny. That's the way to think about it, isn't it? That we tend to think that a president being removed is a very rare occurrence. And actually, it's not. 1 out of every 3 or 4 presidents is removed one way or another. Now, depending on how you count it, it could be even more, because one way we remove presidents we haven't even talked about here yet, which is you just vote them out at the next election. A president has 4 years. Yeah. A president, says, try me on for size, America. And America says, oh, we do not like you. We want to vote anyone else in but you. And we've done that, I think, 10 or 11 times. We've voted out a 1-term president and said, you want a second term, but we're not giving it to you. Closely related to that, the president can even get cut off before then by going to his own party and saying, hi, I'm your sitting president. I'm running again. And the party can say, no, thanks. You suck. We don't want you in here anymore. And that has happened many times. Franklin Pierce, mostly it was in the 1800s.
But even LBJ, right? Because he's like, yeah, I'm not going to run again. And the party's like, you're right. You're not going to. And so when he changed his mind, they're like, no.
Yeah. And there's some debate over this. I mean, Lyndon Johnson went on TV in March of 1968 and said to the American people, looking them straight in the eye, I am not and will not be a candidate for president. I'm going to focus all my attention on solving this Vietnam mess, and I don't want to be distracted or be accused of political machinations here. So he basically took himself out. Right. And then what he did in the succeeding months was do everything one would do if he was planning on getting back in the race. He was talking to political consultants. He was lining up allies. Yes. But he couldn't telegraph that he was doing so, or else it would undermine everything he had said in that speech. So it came to the convention. He was literally sitting at his ranch in Texas with a plane ready to fly him to Chicago to be the knight in shining armor coming into the convention. Secret Service had already planned the route into the convention center. If he only got the call from the floor of the convention saying, "Come and save us from ourselves, Mr. President. We really love you. Come back." But the problem is he didn't tell anybody that he would come back. So they weren't going to do that and have him say, "Was I not clear? Didn't you hear me when I said I'm not going to do it?" Because then that would be embarrassing for them. He also didn't want to put himself out there and say, "I'll come back if you want me," and have them explicitly say, "Yeah, we really don't want you." So it never happened. It was a marriage that was not consummated.
You know, what I really appreciate is that your books are about history over politics. Mm-hmm. And Pete and I try to have that view in all of the things that we discuss, whether we're coming at something from the same angle or from opposite angles. We always try to give it a context that is historical over current politics. And I think that everybody can benefit from that. I think we're terribly distracted right now by the divisiveness of things going on in our country, and that a refocus on our true identity as a country and where we really want to head in the longest term is not only something that we need, but something that people are going to get great influence from reading both of your books. I want to shift gears, though, and move over to the President's Book of Secrets, which again is the untold story of intelligence briefings to America's presidents. And one thing that I really liked was the foreword written by the one man who has delivered and received the presidential briefings. And how did you get the former President Bush, 41, to write that foreword for you at the ripe old age of 91?
Yeah, he was getting up there in years. How did I get him to write the foreword for this book? The answer should be long and complicated and have a great story to it, but simply I asked. Yeah. You know, and I'm not fooling myself. I'd done my homework, I'd done my research, I'd already interviewed virtually every senior former intelligence officer who was retired and willing to talk. I had interviewed senior government officials who either also received this daily book of secrets in various administrations, up to and including vice presidents, almost across the board. So I did my homework first, so that he probably, through his staff, reached out to others and said, "Was this guy serious? Is he doing this the right way? Or is he looking for scandal and looking for leaks?" I'd also had some interactions with him previously, although he almost certainly would not remember them because they were much earlier and not extensive. But simply, I asked him, I explained the project, said that I was doing the first full history of this highly classified, highly controlled document, but I was not looking to reveal its classified content. I was looking to tell the stories that could be told about how it was delivered, how it mattered to presidents, how the CIA and other intelligence officers work to provide the best information possible to every commander-in-chief, regardless of politics, because it's about national security. And he jumped at the chance to do an interview, and that's what I first asked him to do, and got some quotes from him that are in the book. But then I asked him, you're the only person who was director of Central Intelligence and vice president and president. You have a unique perspective on this. Would you like to write a foreword? And the answer was immediate, yes. And I got to say, he did exactly what I thought he would do in the foreword, which is he didn't write about me. He didn't write about the book and what it did or what it didn't do. There's a little bit of that. But he chose to dedicate that forward to all the men and women who work in intelligence, who never get credit because they're usually working in the shadows and they're not looking for publicity. He wanted to shine the light on them and say, "Thank you for everything that you've done." That's why I'm proud that he decided to do that.
Yeah, it's a great point. And he talked about qualified presidential candidates, by the way.
No kidding. No kidding. Yeah, he had everything going for him.
Hillary Clinton's the most qualified candidate. We're like, well, that's fine. That's true. She's highly qualified, but you'd better understand who Henry Clay is, who George Bush the elder is. There's some really qualified people.
Absolutely.
So we're spy versus spy zone now. So it's always fun to have these conversations.
Yeah.
Presidents take their briefings the way they take their briefings. And, again, the current president's such a problem. You always have to caveat everything you say. But when he's like, I don't want a bunch of nonsense from you guys, he gets to say that. Every single president's like, I don't like blue ink, and I like pictures that are blue, red, or, they tell you specifically what they want. And it's your job as the intel provider to write the report in a format that they can receive it in as quickly as possible.
You nailed it. It's not the job of the president to adjust to his intelligence services. It's the job of the intel services to adjust to the president, because the president is the elected representative of the American people. He's the commander in chief. He's the chief executive. And each intelligence agency involved, traditionally CIA, but now others as well, every time there's a presidential election and a campaign and a transition, there's a whole lot of effort that goes into trying to figure out what's the learning style of this president. How do they like to receive information? How will we best be able to communicate what's necessary for him or her to do the job? Not to sway them, not in some deep state conspiracy thing to influence them, but to do their jobs as public servants and make sure that the billions of dollars we spend on intelligence collection and analysis amounts to something, which is giving the president something that he or she can use in a format he or she gets the most out of in order to make better national security decisions based on objective reality and not fantasy. That's what it's all about. And in researching this book and having done some of it back when I was at CIA, but certainly having researched it for all the times that I wasn't there, I found that's pretty much how it goes. It doesn't work perfectly. There's some real ups and downs. But overall, the system does work, finding a way to get the president what he or she needs every day.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
But overall, the system does work, finding a way to get the president what he or she needs every day.
How much of that work to determine the president's style is just dictated by what they tell you they like? And how much of it is saying, well, there's a little more in this that I think you need?
That's a great one, John, because it really does hit both levels. On the one hand, you may know about yourself, and think, all of us, everybody listening, think about yourself. What is the way you like to receive information? And you may say, well, I'm a reader. I like to sit down with my book or my Kindle and go through it. Or you may say, I'm a people person. I like to talk. I like to listen. Okay, that's part of it. You know what you like to do, but you may not know how you actually best internalize information. Maybe you like to read, but you find yourself 6 months later thinking, I don't even remember reading that book. And maybe you need to talk to somebody about the book for it to seal into your memory so that you can use it in the future. So there's really a two-level game here going on. Yes, the best intel professionals, as a new president is coming in, they actually ask the president, Mr. President, how would you like to receive your president's daily brief? Here's the one from the last president, and here's the one maybe from the president before him, and here's a couple of other ways we could do it. Which one do you think you like best? And on some occasions, they've done it that explicitly. But then they also need to have that iterative process with the president, often the president-elect, to say, okay, we're using it in this fashion, the way you thought you'd like, but yes, you're responding more when we talk to you than you are to reading it, or you're responding to what you read better than when we brief it to you orally. So maybe we need to do this. Now, it's up to the president. So they're not going to say, Mr. President, we're going to force you to sit down for 20 minutes a day and read it. No, they're not going to do that. But they can certainly make suggestions or make tweaks to that product to try to better help the president absorb the information that's in there.
Yeah, for sure. As an intelligence operator, my job is to listen to what the boss says. Mm-hmm. And if they're asking questions that I have answers to, and they're the questions that I expect, then my report is exactly where I want it to be.
Right.
When they're getting lost in my information, I've not done my job. When they're asking questions I'm not prepared to answer, I've not done my job. There's a real sweet spot there.
Yeah, there is. And the issue with the president's daily brief, and I think it's true for briefing everything from, a company commander up to the president, is you have to know what they need for their job. The president of the United States does not need to know the details of the logistics of setting up the table in the conference room for the trade negotiations with South Korea. The president doesn't need to know that. But if you are the assistant to the trade negotiator, you might need to know that. So you have to adjust the level for the person you're briefing. And there's been a whole lot of effort across various administrations that we can talk about to adjust this daily product to make sure that each president gets what he needs in the way he needs it.
Have there been any presidents who were overly curious? I don't want to say overly, because I'm curious about this stuff, about CIA gadgets. Because if I was president, I would say I would like my briefing about intelligence around the world. And then I want somebody to sit in here with me every Monday and every Wednesday and show me and explain to me some gadget you guys are using.
Yeah, there have been some. And it's funny that not all of them are like that, or at least we don't know if they're like that, because here's the thing. Most presidents did not take daily in-person briefings from working level intelligence officers. They received the president's daily brief. Most of them read it or had their national security advisor in the White House brief them on it. Most of them met at least occasionally with their director of central intelligence, or now the director of national intelligence. But only a few made a habit of not only reading it every day, but also taking an in-person briefing all the time where they could have somebody bring in gadgets. So I'll go back to, let's say, Dwight Eisenhower or John Kennedy. Now, they took intelligence briefings. That was before the thing called the President's Daily Brief existed, but they still had some intelligence coming their way. But they didn't have a daily sit-down with those intel officers. Richard Nixon did not have an oral briefing once in his presidency from a President's Daily Brief officer briefing that daily content. So there was no one who could bring in the gadget in that setting and do it. But I guarantee you, virtually every president, at least since World War II, during some meeting with a spy chief, has had some gadget or some device or some technology that the director wanted to show off because it was just so good. When that does intersect with the president's daily brief, it makes for a great story. Like one I include in the book is when Jana Mendez, the wife of the late Tony Mendez of Argo fame, both of them worked in the CIA's Office of Technical Services. And among the things they did was work on disguises. And disguise technology has evolved greatly over the years, but sometimes it evolves in bursts. And at the time that George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, was president, there was one of those bursts. And Jana Mendez, this is before she had married Tony, but Jana at the time had been working on this and gave a briefing to the director of the CIA, Judge Webster, about this technology and showed it off. And he thought, this is amazing. He said, you're coming with me to the White House tomorrow. And she said, wait, what? And he actually took her to the president's daily briefing, and she was wearing this disguise. And she pretended to be there to brief him on something else. But then once she's in the room, she goes and shows him, Mr. President, some of us in the office remember when you came to CIA down to the Office of Technical Services when you were our director back in the 70s. And this is where the disguise technology was then. And then she goes back to her seat and sits down and says, Mr. President, we've come a long way since then. In fact, I'm wearing it now. And the president just kind of dropped everything, stared at her. She started to get up and he just said, no, sit down. And he gets up and walks around her, kind of looks at her from all angles, and then sits down behind the Oval Office desk and says, okay, take it off. And then he gets to see how this technology worked that wasn't there to impress the president. The reason they developed it was to let case officers out on the street in places like Moscow turn a corner and become a different person within seconds before KGB surveillance could figure out what happened. But the president was interested in that kind of thing, and he absolutely loved it.
In my imagination, I just want to say that that meeting happened, and right before the big reveal, she said, "Mr. President, I'm not actually John Sununu," and then took off the disguise. I'm positive that's not how it happened, but that's how I want it to happen.
That would have been great. In fact, I think she told me, I think this may not be in the book, but she told me and I talked to everybody who was in that room, I believe, except for one senior CIA officer who was not able to do an interview. But all the people in the room either remembered it or remembered everybody telling stories about it afterwards, except John Sununu. Jonna said that John Sununu had his head down in the PDB and was focusing on it so much that he was reading, he wasn't even listening. And so he looked up and he had no idea what had just happened. But everybody else got a big kick out of it.
Doing his damn job like he's supposed to.
That's right.
How dare he? How dare he focus on national security at a time like this?
By the way, I want to encourage all my friends listening because you guys really will dig this story. I love that you brought it up because I actually was watching her episode of Wired's Masters.
Yeah.
So you can look up just Joanna Mendez. If you look her up, you'll see she talks about the story all the time. And there's pictures of her.
She has a new book out too called The Moscow Rules, which she co-wrote with Tony before his death earlier this year. And now, in addition to all the book writing and everything, I'm the chief operating officer at Lawfare, the Lawfare Institute, where we do, national security analysis and educational things for people learning about the nexus of national security law, policy, all of that. But we have a podcast, the Lawfare Podcast, and I had her on a few weeks ago. And that was one of our most popular recent episodes. And I tell you, it ain't because of me. It's because Jonna is such a good storyteller and she could talk about all of this great technology that CIA worked on. Again, the purpose of it was to get that case officer that extra few seconds to meet that asset in Moscow, to get that information. But what did we do with that information? The whole reason we collect intelligence is to get it to people who can use it. That's the commander in the field. That's the ambassador in a foreign country. Or often, it's the president of the United States himself.
Yeah, let me jump in here with this too, because this is what makes these things interesting. One, I would love to have Jonna on the show, so let's talk about that afterwards. But you're right, like that disguise isn't meant to be a long-term fooling thing. It might buy you an extra week in country or an extra month or whatever. You're just trying to extend your ability to do the job in place, because once you're there, it's so hard to do that. We had Jack Barsky on the show. He was a KGB embed in the States. He was like the Americans. Everybody should go check that episode out. And, because guys like us, we know this stuff, David. I was like, okay, so as you're trying to cover your tracks and send your burst messages and all your special communications, at one point, was it just so much stuff? It's just overwhelming, because covering your tracks for everything you do, it takes an enormous amount of time. Like, that's the part they don't show you in the movies, like pre-walking a surveillance detection route, planning that out, driving it, determining what pitfall. I mean, there's just so much triple checking, quadruple checking that you just run out of time to do these things. So these disguises are powerful, but understand it's not necessarily to fool anybody. It's just to buy you time in the back end.
Yeah, I was surprised and it's kind of the connecting point between her work and her book and mine about the president's daily brief is, if you think about it, all of this time and effort goes into getting an officer, let's say, into Moscow and having that person be clear of surveillance, which involves technology. It involves time. It involves routes. It involves counterintelligence to know what the KGB is doing. All of that in order to get one meeting, maybe 6 months later, with that Soviet scientist who has those designs about that next generation Soviet, back then Soviet weapon. And why? Because that might involve a strategic decision that has to be made at the highest level. It might be one page in the PDB 6 months from now. All of that effort goes into making sure that the president has what people in intelligence now call the best decision advantage possible, having the best picture of the battlefield at a tactical level or of international relations at the higher level, to make sure that the best decisions are made based on the information at the time. And that's what the president's daily brief is all about, is making sure that the commander-in-chief himself gets the information that's useful to him.
Also, you're trying to protect that source, that Russian scientist, that senator whose car you drive around every day. Mm-hmm. You're trying to just be as normal as possible. So your bona fides is never the hawk flies at midnight. It's like, hey, did you get tickets to the Redskins game? And then the other person says back, I did, but they're in section 102. There's a whole conversation right there as part of a bona fides, and then the person responds in a certain way. Because once you develop a source and they're the Russian scientist. You don't want to expose that person to any harm at all. They're so precious. Like you care about them because you care about the information, but also like if you have to, and you're going to get them out, it's better to get them out of country before they get.
And let me tell you, we care about, and I say we CIA, we U.S. intelligence, we care about that so much that as a general rule, and I would say almost without exception, the president of the United States himself doesn't know the names of sources. And it could be the issue that he cares about the most. It could be something that is so important. And yet in the president's daily brief itself, it might say something like a senior Iraqi government official. And the president, most of them, don't even think to ask who that source is, because if they know it's a source who's been vetted, and they know that the CIA and the intelligence community is putting it into the president's daily brief, that information has been vetted and has the appropriate caveats in there about haven't confirmed this information, or this source is telling us this, but we have other sources telling us this, that they'll do that if they have that information. That's why it was so disturbing in the run-up to the Iraq War, when suddenly a lot of the information going to the president relied on only a few sources, including the famous curveball, the one that was outside of U.S. control. The Germans were running curveball, and we didn't have the full assessment information. And here's the president making decisions in part based on some of that intelligence that was just wrong. So you can understand how this intersects from the street level collection of intelligence all the way up to major decisions of war, life and death. It depends on the whole intelligence cycle working, and the delivery of that to the president is the ultimate step.
I want to acknowledge that your education you're a doctor of political science.
That's correct.
But some people would view the president's book of secrets, as much as it is dedicated to the president's daily briefing, as somewhat of a business book.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's about decision advantage.
I've had conversations with that and given speeches to business groups about, the lessons of providing information to the president. What can companies essentially learn from that? Because listen, everybody's got a customer, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're a corporation, or whether you're in the government. We always referred to, back when I was briefing the president's daily brief back in the George W. Bush administration, we always referred to the president, the vice president, the national security advisor, the FBI director, the people who were getting this product in our briefings. We referred to them as customers because that's what they were. And it wasn't that the customer was always right, that old mantra you hear in retail sales. It wasn't that we told the customer what they wanted to hear. Our job serving the customer was telling them what they needed to hear. That's the role of intelligence. Well, those lessons are applicable to others. If you're briefing the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, the Fortune 500 company CEO doesn't need a yes man saying something that he already believes. If he's deciding where to invest $1 billion data center, he needs somebody telling him, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and this is our best suggestion based on those facts. Well, there are a lot of parallels from intelligence in terms of knowing the customer, knowing their learning style, and presenting the information in a way to make sure that all that hard work helps them make their decision.
Yeah, that business sense, right? And then when the boss looks at you, whether it's a CEO or the president or the commander, and they go, I wonder, like, that's when you grab your pen and you're like, my customer's buying something else. Right.
Absolutely. You got them hooked. They want more information. And that, honestly, in the President's Book of Secrets book, that was really the joy of researching and writing it, is finding out the curiosity, not always of the president. Some presidents did not interact with their president's daily brief as much as others. Richard Nixon was one. Despite his high interest in international relations, he did not ever take a briefing of the book. He probably read it, but he didn't take a briefing. But I learned that somebody in every administration interacted extensively with this high-level intelligence and used it as an opportunity to get more information out of the experts in the intelligence community. In the Nixon administration, it was people like the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, and the Secretary of Defense. In more recent administrations, often it's been the president himself who has taken an active role in the president's daily brief. But there's always somebody who wants this information and uses that as an opportunity to dig even deeper and get more advantage out of this process.
There's a couple things I want to say. There's a communication process that happens from this. Again, the customer's like, oh, let's find out about this. Or if we're going to do this, harmful action that deals with something, I need to know X. So that way, the next time you guys come in, with the package plus X already thought out, whatever those things are. And we can't get too much into that because then you start getting trade crafty. But also, if you're a person who ends up somewhere pretty far up that chain, but especially in the president's book, and you keep having intel that shows up there, there's a conversation that's going to come down. Like a guy like me in the Army, if I develop a source that's valuable, someone's going to take that source from me. And it's great because the CIA has more resources than I do. They've got longer term things. I might get this guy killed in the next 8 minutes because of what we do as being so dangerous, so there is a conversation in career wise, like, hey, this guy gets good stuff, see what he's doing. And, I've had that guy show up. I've had the guy in the top siders in a combat zone say, hey, what are you doing? How are you getting, and it's interesting. And all that stuff comes from that, not necessarily the president's book of secrets, but all of the cone of information that flows to that pinnacle.
Right. And the care that goes into doing it. I didn't write the story of the care that goes into it at the collection level. This wasn't a book about intelligence collection. Thankfully, there are some very good memoirs and other books out there about specific cases of intel collectors and what they do and the risks that they go to do it. But nobody had written a book about how that gets to the president in the form of this daily book that started in the 1960s and has continued for every president since. So I wanted to tell that side of it because you don't really get those stories unless presidents decide in their obligatory memoirs when they leave office that they're going to devote a few sentences to it. A couple of presidents have, but most have not. But all of them that were alive were willing to talk to me for this book. So I got insight from presidents, vice presidents, CIA directors who felt that they could share some of these inside stories, not classified information, but inside stories, in order to bring alive the story of this book and how it's influenced history in the modern era.
I just want to thank you for stoking our curiosities with these books because they're both fascinating. They're both topical, but they're both timeless. And for honoring those curiosities with information that's so much deeper in context, and for making us and our listeners who are going to go out and buy the books and read them. Again, listeners, go to Amazon where you can get the book, you can get the audio book, and you can get the Kindle versions of the books. And you should get them both. History wins over politics.
Yeah.
And that's really the point that I would like to drive home about what makes us smarter by reading these books.
And
so
I'm going to add in, and you guys know what I'm about to say here. When you go to Amazon to buy this book, obviously you're supporting David's work, but also these cool ass spy versus spy episodes. I mean, you just heard a conversation about espionage that you can't get anywhere else because you got two guys who are practitioners giving you insight into this. So do David the solid of rating and reviewing his book by putting those stars next to his book on Amazon and just writing even 10 words, 20 words, 25 words. All of that helps other people find his fantastic work. And let me tell you, I read the President's Book of Secrets, and it's fantastic. I learned so many things about a profession that I'm a part of. I know about Wild Bill, and I know about Dulles and all these different people that were part of it. But if you guys don't, there's so much to learn. It's so fascinating how the intelligence structure came about and how late in our history that it came about. So definitely check this book out.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, guys, and hopefully the book lives up to that effusive praise. All I can hope for is that anybody who's interested in how intelligence or national security policy works will get something out of this because of the interviews and the research that just hadn't been done before. And if you're a junkie on this stuff like I am, it's the kind of book that I like to read. And I was just blessed enough that I was able to interview the policymakers and the intel professionals and then actually write the book about it. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, that had to be fun. Thanks again. Dr. David Priess, everybody.